The mahogany conference table stretched between them like a battlefield, its polished surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights of the law office. Marcus Thornfield adjusted his Italian silk tie with practiced confidence, the gesture as calculated as everything else about him. Across from him sat his soon-to-be wife, Elena, her hands folded quietly in her lap, eyes downcast in what appeared to be resigned defeat. The contrast between them could not have been more stark. Marcus radiated success from his perfectly pressed Armani suit to his gleaming Rolex Submariner, while Elena wore a simple navy dress that seemed to fade into the background of the sterile office. I have to ask, where are you watching this from today? This story takes place in the heart of Manhattan's financial district, where million-dollar decisions are made daily and appearances mean everything. Drop a comment and let me know what state or country you're tuning in from, because what happens next will shock you no matter where you are in the world. The lead attorney for Marcus, Harrison Blake, spread documents across the table with theatrical precision. His reputation for ruthless efficiency and high-stakes divorces was legendary among Manhattan's elite. Blake had built his career on ensuring wealthy men kept their fortunes intact, and Marcus Thornfield was exactly the type of client he specialized in protecting. The preliminary asset division proposal lay before them like a manifesto of masculine dominance. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, his voice dripping with condescension as he addressed the room. This woman, he declared with a dismissive wave toward Elena, had contributed exactly nothing to their 15-year marriage beyond basic childcare duties. She had never held a real job, never earned a single dollar, never participated in any meaningful way in building their substantial wealth. The vacation homes in the Hamptons and Aspen, the investment portfolio worth millions, the luxury vehicles, the art collection, all of it was the result of his vision, his work, his superior intellect and business acumen. Elena's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria Chambers, sat quietly taking notes. There was something unsettling about her composure, the way she seemed almost amused by Marcus's increasingly pompous declarations. She was not the typical divorce attorney one might expect for a supposedly powerless housewife. Victoria Chambers had a reputation of her own, though Marcus was too blinded by his own arrogance to recognize the warning signs. The preliminary hearing had been scheduled as a formality, Marcus explained to his attorney with growing enthusiasm. Elena would receive whatever minimal settlement the court deemed appropriate for someone who had essentially been a live-in babysitter for their 3 children. He spoke about her as if she were not sitting 3 feet away, as if she were merely a piece of furniture to be discussed and disposed of at his convenience. Blake nodded approvingly at his client's assessment. In his experience, these cases involving stay-at-home wives were straightforward. The women rarely had the resources or knowledge to mount effective challenges to their husbands' financial claims. They typically accepted whatever crumbs were offered and disappeared quietly into obscurity. Elena Thornfield appeared to fit this pattern perfectly, but Victoria Chambers continued taking her methodical notes, occasionally glancing up at Marcus with an expression that might have been mistaken for professional interest. Her briefcase, notably, was considerably thicker than Blake's, stuffed with manila folders that seemed to strain against the leather confines. For someone representing a supposedly assetless housewife, she had brought an unusual amount of documentation. Marcus warmed to his theme, detailing how Elena had spent her days in leisurely activities while he built their empire. Shopping excursions, charity luncheons, book clubs with other wealthy wives who had nothing better to do than gossip and spend their husbands' money. She had lived a life of complete luxury without contributing a single meaningful thing to their financial success. The irony was delicious, he proclaimed, that someone who had never even balanced a checkbook might think she deserved half of what he had worked so hard to create. Elena remained silent throughout this character assassination, her expression unreadable. Occasionally she would glance at Victoria Chambers, who would give the slightest nod, as if confirming some prearranged signal. The dynamic between the 2 women suggested a level of preparation and coordination that seemed oddly sophisticated for what Marcus assumed would be a simple proceeding. Blake began outlining the settlement offer with obvious satisfaction. Elena would receive the minimum allowable alimony, temporary use of one of their smaller properties until she could secure appropriate housing elsewhere, and limited access to one of their lesser investment accounts for basic living expenses. The children, now teenagers, would primarily reside with Marcus in the main family residence, a sprawling estate in Greenwich that showcased his success to anyone who visited. The offer was generous considering her lack of contributions, Marcus added with false magnanimity. He was being more than fair to someone who had essentially been supported entirely by his efforts for the better part of 2 decades. Any reasonable person would recognize this as an appropriate division of assets based on actual contribution and effort. Victoria Chambers finally spoke, her voice carrying a subtle steel beneath its professional politeness. She thanked Blake for the preliminary offer, but indicated that her client would need time to review the proposal thoroughly. There were, she mentioned almost casually, some documentation questions that would need to be addressed before any final agreements could be reached. Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of humor but full of dismissive confidence. What documentation could possibly be relevant? He asked rhetorically. Elena had never owned anything of value, never signed any significant contracts, never participated in any business decisions. Her name appeared on virtually nothing of importance because she had never been important to their financial success. The smile that flickered across Victoria Chambers' face at that moment was so brief that only Elena caught it. But in that fleeting expression lay the promise of revelations that would shatter Marcus Thornfield's carefully constructed narrative of superiority and reduce his arrogant certainty to absolute ruins. Blake pulled out a leather portfolio thick with property assessments and financial statements, each page representing another piece of the Thornfield empire that Marcus was determined to protect. The Hampton estate alone was valued at $12 million, he announced with obvious pride. Marcus had personally negotiated that purchase in 2018, recognizing the investment potential when others had foolishly overlooked the property's unique advantages. The Aspen Lodge, worth $8 million, had been another stroke of his business genius, acquired during a market downturn when lesser investors were running scared. Marcus nodded enthusiastically at each valuation, adding his own commentary about the strategic thinking behind every acquisition. The downtown Manhattan penthouse, their primary residence worth $15 million, showcased his understanding of urban real estate trends. He had seen the neighborhood's potential years before it became the fashionable address it was today. Elena had contributed nothing to these decisions beyond occasionally commenting on paint colors and furniture arrangements. Victoria Chambers looked up from her notes with apparent curiosity. She wondered, she said in a tone of professional interest, about the timeline of these acquisitions. When exactly had the Hampton property been purchased, and what was the source of the down payment for such a substantial investment? Her question seemed innocent enough, the kind of routine inquiry any competent attorney might make during discovery proceedings. Marcus waved dismissively at the question. The details were all properly documented, he assured her. His business success had generated more than sufficient capital for real estate investments. Elena had never needed to concern herself with such complicated financial matters, which was precisely why she was so poorly equipped to understand the true nature of their wealth. But Victoria persisted gently. The source of down payments was always relevant in divorce proceedings, she explained. Courts needed to understand how assets were acquired and who had contributed to their purchase. She was simply trying to establish a clear timeline of financial events during the marriage. Blake interrupted with mild irritation. His client's business success was well documented and beyond question. Marcus Thornfield had built a consulting firm from nothing into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. The source of his wealth was his own professional excellence, not some mystery requiring detailed investigation. Elena sat quietly during this exchange, but her posture had subtly shifted. Where before she had appeared dejected and defeated, now she seemed almost watchful, as if she were observing a performance whose outcome she already knew. When Marcus glanced in her direction, expecting to see the familiar resignation, he instead caught a glimpse of something that might have been suppressed amusement. The revelation annoyed him more than it should have. Elena's expression suggested she knew something he did not, which was impossible given her complete exclusion from all meaningful business decisions. She had never shown the slightest interest in financial matters, never asked penetrating questions about investments or business strategies. Her concerns had always been limited to household management and child-related activities. Marcus decided to make his position crystal clear. Elena, he announced to the room, had been the definition of a trophy wife. Beautiful enough to enhance his professional image at corporate events, competent enough to manage household staff and coordinate social obligations, but entirely dependent on his financial support and business acumen. She had never earned money, never managed investments, never contributed intellectually to any significant decision that had built their substantial wealth. The cruelty in his assessment was deliberately calculated. Marcus wanted to ensure that everyone in the room understood exactly how powerless Elena had been throughout their marriage. She had been a decorative accessory to his success story, nothing more. The idea that she might deserve substantial assets in their divorce was not just legally questionable, but morally offensive. Victoria Chambers continued taking notes, but she also began pulling specific documents from her overstuffed briefcase. Each folder was labeled with precise dates and property addresses, suggesting a level of preparation that seemed almost obsessive for a case involving someone who supposedly owned nothing. She asked about the Manhattan penthouse next, specifically about the renovation costs that had transformed it from a modest apartment into a luxury showpiece. Marcus launched into detailed explanations of his vision for the renovation project. He had personally overseen every aspect of the transformation, from the custom Italian marble in the master bathroom to the handcrafted kitchen cabinetry imported from Germany. The project had cost nearly $2 million, but the result was a residence that perfectly reflected his sophisticated taste and financial success. Elena had occasionally offered opinions about color schemes, but the real decisions had all been his. But as Marcus spoke, fragments of memory began intruding on his confident narrative. Elena researching architects for weeks before they selected the renovation team. Elena spending hours with contractors discussing structural possibilities that he had not even considered. Elena somehow knowing exactly which permits would be required and how to navigate the COOP board approval process that had stymied other residents for months. He pushed these inconvenient recollections aside. Elena may have handled some of the tedious administrative details, but the vision and financial resources had been entirely his contribution. She had simply been following his instructions and implementing his decisions. Victoria asked about the Aspen property next, specifically about the complicated purchase process that had involved multiple competing offers. Marcus began explaining his negotiation strategy with renewed enthusiasm, but again, unwelcome memories began surfacing. Elena somehow knowing about the property before it was publicly listed. Elena having personal connections with local real estate agents who provided inside information about the seller's motivations. Elena understanding complex mountain property regulations that had confused even his experienced attorney. The pattern was becoming uncomfortably apparent, but Marcus refused to acknowledge its implications. Elena had always been surprisingly knowledgeable about random topics, probably from her endless reading and socializing with other wealthy wives. Her occasional insights had been helpful, but they had never been essential to his success. Blake began detailing the investment portfolio, another area where Marcus's financial genius was clearly demonstrated. Stock selections, bond allocations, real estate investment trusts, all carefully chosen to maximize returns while minimizing risk. The portfolio's current value exceeded $20 million, testament to years of shrewd decision-making and market timing. Victoria nodded approvingly at the portfolio's impressive performance, then asked which brokerage firms had been used for these investments. Marcus named several prestigious firms, emphasizing his personal relationships with top-tier financial advisors who understood his sophisticated investment philosophy. But Victoria's next question stopped him mid-sentence. She asked about the account ownership structure and who had signing authority for various transactions. The question hung in the air like an unexploded bomb, its implications slowly dawning on everyone in the room except Elena, who continued watching the proceedings with that same expression of quiet anticipation. Marcus felt the first flicker of genuine unease as he realized that he could not immediately answer Victoria's simple question about account ownership. He had always assumed that his name was on everything, but the actual paperwork had been handled by Elena in her capacity as household financial manager. She had always been meticulous about such details, ensuring that all documentation was properly filed and organized. For the first time since entering the conference room, Marcus began to suspect that his complete victory might not be as certain as he had believed. Victoria Chambers reached into her briefcase with deliberate precision, withdrawing a manila folder so thick it required both hands to lift properly. The weight of documentation within seemed almost excessive for what Blake had assumed would be a straightforward asset division case. She placed the folder on the conference table with a soft thud that somehow commanded everyone's attention, then began methodically removing individual documents as if unveiling carefully cataloged evidence. The first document she extracted was a property deed, crisp and official, bearing the distinctive seal of the New York State Department of Records. She handled it with the reverence of someone presenting a masterpiece, smoothing the corners and positioning it where everyone could clearly see the text. The Manhattan Penthouse deed, she announced quietly, purchased in March of 2019 for $14.7 million. Marcus leaned forward with confident interest, expecting to see his own name prominently displayed as the primary owner. This was his crown jewel property, the residence that had required his most sophisticated financing and had showcased his business success to everyone who mattered in Manhattan's elite circles. But as his eyes focused on the ownership line, his expression began to shift from satisfaction to confusion. The property deed listed Elena Marie Thornfield as the sole owner. Not joint ownership, not even primary ownership with Marcus as secondary. Elena's name appeared alone in the ownership section, with Marcus listed merely as a resident spouse with no legal claim to the property itself. The document was signed, notarized, and filed with complete legal authority. Blake snatched the deed from the table, studying it with growing alarm. This had to be some kind of clerical error, he declared with forced confidence. Property deeds were occasionally misfiled or incorrectly recorded, especially in complex real estate transactions involving multiple parties and financing arrangements. He would need to contact the title company immediately to correct this obvious mistake. Victoria Chambers smiled with the patience of someone who had anticipated exactly this reaction. She informed Blake that the deed was entirely accurate and had been thoroughly verified through multiple sources. Elena had indeed purchased the Manhattan Penthouse as her sole property, using funds from her personal investment accounts to secure the purchase without requiring Marcus's financial participation or co-signature. Marcus felt his world tilting sideways as the implications began sinking in. Elena could not possibly have had access to $15 million for a real estate purchase. She had never worked, never earned substantial income, never had independent access to significant financial resources. The idea that she had somehow acquired their most valuable property without his knowledge or involvement was not just surprising, but seemingly impossible. Victoria reached back into her folder and extracted a second document, this one bearing the official seal of Suffolk County Records. The Hampton Estate deed, dated August 2018, valued at the time of purchase at $11.8 million. Once again, Elena Marie Thornfield was listed as the sole owner, with Marcus having no legal claim to the property beyond spousal residence rights. Blake was now frantically shuffling through his own documentation, searching for property records that would contradict what Victoria was presenting. His files contained extensive financial information about Marcus's business income and asset valuations, but he was beginning to realize that he had never actually verified ownership documentation for the properties themselves. He had simply assumed that Marcus's financial success meant automatic ownership of their marital assets. The third deed Victoria presented covered the Aspen Lodge, purchased in December 2020 for $7.9 million. Elena's name appeared as sole owner on this document as well, along with detailed financing information that showed she had provided the entire down payment from her personal accounts and had secured the mortgage using her independent credit rating. Marcus was now staring at the documents with genuine shock, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. These could not all be clerical errors, he stammered. There had to be some explanation that would restore the reality he had believed in for the past several years. Perhaps Elena had been used as a front for tax purposes, or maybe there had been some complex legal strategy that he had forgotten about. Victoria calmly explained that property ownership was always a matter of public record and legal documentation. When someone's name appeared on a deed as sole owner, That designation carried absolute legal authority regardless of who might have been residing in the property or contributing to its maintenance. Elena had purchased these properties using her own financial resources and had legal ownership rights that could not be disputed or reversed without her explicit consent. Blake demanded to see the source of funds documentation that would prove how Elena had acquired the millions of dollars necessary for these purchases. No one could simply materialize $15 million without substantial income or inheritance, and Elena's background showed no evidence of either possibility. Victoria was clearly prepared for this challenge. She extracted a leather portfolio containing bank statements, investment account records, and financial transaction histories spanning more than a decade. Elena's personal accounts showed consistent deposits, strategic investment decisions, and careful wealth accumulation that had generated the resources necessary for their real estate purchases. Marcus grabbed the bank statements with desperate urgency, scanning the account numbers and transaction details. These were accounts he had never seen before, financial institutions he did not recognize, investment strategies that seemed far too sophisticated for someone who had supposedly never concerned herself with money management. The account balances were staggering, showing liquid assets that exceeded his own business accounts by substantial margins. The earliest statements dated back to 2010, just 3 years after their marriage. Elena had been systematically building wealth from sources that Marcus had never known existed. Regular deposits from investment returns, dividend payments from stock holdings, rental income from properties he had never heard of, all carefully managed and steadily growing year after year. Blake was studying the documentation with increasing bewilderment. The investment portfolio Elena had been managing showed remarkable sophistication and timing. She had purchased technology stocks before their explosive growth periods, had invested in real estate markets before they appreciated substantially, and had diversified across asset classes in ways that demonstrated advanced financial knowledge. Marcus felt physically ill as the reality of his situation became undeniable. Elena had not been the powerless dependent he had assumed throughout their marriage. She had been systematically building an independent financial empire while allowing him to believe that he was the source of their family's wealth and success. Every assumption he had made about their relationship had been built on completely false foundations. Victoria continued presenting documentation with methodical precision. Business partnership agreements showing Elena as a silent partner in several successful ventures. Investment fund management contracts with Elena listed as the primary decision-maker. Real estate development projects where Elena had provided initial funding and maintained controlling interests. The pattern was becoming overwhelmingly clear. Elena had been the hidden financial force behind what Marcus had believed was his own success story. She had allowed him to take credit publicly while maintaining actual legal control of their substantial assets. Every property he had boasted about, every investment he had claimed credit for, every aspect of their luxury lifestyle had been built on Elena's financial foundation rather than his business achievements. Blake was frantically taking notes, trying to understand how his client's case had suddenly transformed from a routine asset protection matter into a complete legal disaster. Marcus had no legitimate claim to any of the major properties, no legal ownership of the investment accounts, and apparently no understanding of how their wealth had actually been accumulated. Marcus looked across the table at Elena, seeing her clearly for the first time in years. She was no longer the quiet, dependent housewife he had dismissed so confidently just hours earlier. Her calm demeanor now seemed less like resignation and more like the patience of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment of revelation. She had orchestrated every aspect of their financial life while allowing him to live in a fantasy of his own importance and control. Victoria announced that she had additional documentation to review, but suggested they might want to take a brief recess before continuing. The next phase of evidence would be even more comprehensive, she warned, and would require everyone's full attention to understand the complete scope of Elena's financial holdings and legal ownership rights. Marcus realized that his carefully planned victory had already become a devastating defeat, and they had only just begun to uncover the true extent of Elena's strategic preparation for this moment. Victoria Chambers had only begun her systematic dismantling of Marcus's reality. After the brief recess that Blake had desperately requested to collect himself, She returned to the conference table with a second briefcase, this one even more substantial than the first. The additional documentation, she explained with professional courtesy, would provide a complete picture of the actual financial structure underlying the Thornfield family assets. Blake had spent the break frantically calling his office, demanding that his assistants verify property ownership records and cross-reference Marcus's claims about asset acquisition. The preliminary results had been devastating. Not only were Elena's property ownerships legitimate, but there appeared to be additional assets that Marcus had never mentioned because he had apparently never known they existed. Marcus returned to his seat with visible agitation, his earlier confidence replaced by a barely controlled panic. He had built his entire divorce strategy around maintaining control of assets he now discovered he had never legally owned. The implications were staggering not just for the divorce proceedings, but for his understanding of his own life over the past 15 years. Victoria began the second phase of her presentation by addressing Marcus's business achievements directly. His consulting firm, Thornfield Strategic Solutions, had indeed been highly successful over the past decade. However, she noted with careful precision, the business registration documents told a more complex story about ownership and funding than Marcus had apparently realized. She produced the original business incorporation papers, filed with New York State in 2015. Marcus was listed as Chief Executive Officer and public face of the company, but Elena Marie Thornfield appeared as the majority owner with 65% controlling interest. The initial business funding of $2.8 million had come entirely from Elena's personal investment accounts, with Marcus contributing no capital to the venture that bore his name. Marcus snatched the incorporation documents, studying them with growing horror. This was impossible, he insisted with increasing desperation. He had founded the company himself, had developed all the client relationships, had created the business strategies that generated millions in revenue. Elena had never shown any interest in business ownership or corporate strategy. Victoria calmly corrected his assumptions. Elena had indeed shown substantial interest in business ownership. She had simply chosen to remain a silent partner while allowing Marcus to serve as the public representative of her investment. The consulting firm's success had been built on Elena's financial backing and strategic guidance, though she had preferred to let Marcus receive the public credit for their achievements. Blake interrupted with accusations of fraud and document manipulation. There was no way that Elena could have secretly owned a majority stake in Marcus's business without his knowledge. Corporate ownership was a matter of legal record that required signed agreements and mutual consent from all parties involved. Victoria produced a thick folder of signed contracts, partnership agreements, and financial transfer records. Every document bore Marcus's signature alongside Elena's, indicating his full knowledge and consent to the ownership structure. The paperwork showed that Marcus had not only agreed to Elena's majority ownership, but had actively requested her financial backing to launch and expand the business. Marcus studied his own signature on document after document, each one undermining his claims of ignorance about Elena's role in his business success. The contracts were comprehensive and detailed, outlining Elena's financial contributions and decision-making authority in language that was impossible to misunderstand or misinterpret. The consulting firm was only the beginning of Elena's business empire, Victoria continued. She had ownership stakes in 17 different companies across various industries, from technology startups to established manufacturing enterprises. Her investment portfolio included controlling interests in real estate development projects, renewable energy ventures, and financial services companies that generated substantial passive income streams. Victoria spread these business ownership documents across the conference table like playing cards in a winning hand. Each company showed Elena as either the majority owner or a significant shareholder with substantial influence over corporate decisions. The combined value of her business interests exceeded $50 million, making her one of the wealthiest individual investors in the greater New York area. Marcus was now hyperventilating as he processed the scope of Elena's hidden financial empire. She had been systematically building wealth and acquiring business interests while he had remained completely oblivious to her activities. Every social event where he had boasted about his business acumen had been built on foundations that Elena had created and maintained. Blake demanded to see tax returns that would verify these business ownership claims. No one could maintain such extensive business interests without generating substantial taxable income that would appear on official government filings. Victoria produced Elena's tax returns for the past 10 years, each one showing income levels that dwarfed Marcus's consulting fees by enormous margins. Her investment returns alone generated more annual income than Marcus's business had ever produced, and her business partnership distributions added millions more to her yearly earnings. Marcus grabbed the tax returns, scanning the income figures with complete disbelief. Elena had been earning between $8 and $12 million annually, while he had struggled to generate $2 million from his consulting work. She had been quietly paying the majority of their household expenses, their children's private school tuition, and their luxury lifestyle costs without ever mentioning her financial contributions. The bank account records Victoria presented next showed the true source of funding for every aspect of their marriage. The mortgage payments on all properties had come from Elena's accounts. The luxury vehicle purchases, the private school tuitions, the expensive vacations, the country club memberships, all had been funded by Elena's business success rather than Marcus's earnings. Marcus realized that he had been living as Elena's dependent while believing himself to be the family's primary breadwinner. Every element of the lifestyle he had used to demonstrate his success had been subsidized by his wife's superior earning power and financial management skills. Victoria then addressed Marcus's retirement accounts and investment portfolios, the assets he had assumed would provide security for his post-divorce future. The 401k account he had been contributing to for years was actually structured as a joint account with Elena as the primary beneficiary. His stock portfolio had been purchased using Elena's funding and was registered under her name for tax optimization purposes. Even Marcus's personal checking account, he discovered, was actually a joint account where Elena had been quietly covering overdrafts and maintaining the balance whenever his consulting income had fallen short of their expenses. He had never been financially independent at any point during their marriage, though Elena had carefully maintained the illusion of his economic autonomy. Blake was now openly panicking as he realized that his client had no significant assets to protect in the divorce proceedings. Marcus owned almost nothing of value beyond his clothing, personal effects, and a small savings account that contained less than $50,000. Everything else belonged entirely to Elena through legitimate ownership and proper documentation. Marcus made a desperate attempt to claim fraud, insisting that Elena must have forged documents or manipulated financial records to create false ownership claims. No one could have maintained such an extensive deception for 15 years without him noticing some evidence of her activities. Elena finally spoke for the first time since the proceedings had begun, her voice carrying an authority that had been completely absent from her earlier demeanor. She informed Marcus that there had been no deception whatsoever. Every business decision, every property purchase, every investment strategy had been discussed with him in detail before implementation. He had simply chosen to ignore or dismiss her explanations because he had preferred to believe himself the superior partner. She reminded him of countless conversations where she had explained her investment strategies, described her business partnerships, and outlined her financial planning for their family's future. Marcus had consistently responded with condescending dismissals, telling her that she should not worry about complicated financial matters that were beyond her understanding. Elena's transformation from quiet victim to commanding presence was complete and shocking. She detailed specific instances where Marcus had refused to listen to her business advice, had dismissed her investment suggestions, and had actually prevented her from taking public credit for achievements that were entirely her own creation. The consulting firm that had made Marcus's reputation was built on strategies Elena had developed through her other business ventures. The client relationships he had boasted about were often connections Elena had facilitated through her extensive professional network. Even his most successful projects had succeeded because Elena had provided behind-the-scenes support and resources that he had taken for granted. Marcus was now sobbing openly as the complete scope of his delusion became undeniable. He had spent 15 years as Elena's kept husband while convincing himself that he was the dominant partner in their relationship. His entire identity as a successful businessman had been an elaborate fiction that Elena had maintained to protect his fragile ego. Victoria announced that she had additional documentation regarding Elena's international investments, offshore accounts, and foreign property holdings that would need to be reviewed in subsequent meetings. The assets they had discussed today represented only Elena's domestic holdings, she explained. Her complete financial empire was considerably more extensive and would require additional time to present comprehensively. Blake sat in stunned silence, realizing that his client's divorce case had transformed from asset protection into damage control. Marcus would be lucky to receive any settlement at all from a woman whose wealth and business success so completely overshadowed his own modest achievements. Elena looked at Marcus with what might have been pity as she watched him process the complete destruction of his self-image. The man who had entered the conference room expecting to dictate the terms of their divorce had discovered that he had never possessed any power in their relationship beyond what she had chosen to allow him to exercise. The methodical revelation of Elena's true financial position had not only secured her legal victory, but had exposed Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of their entire marriage. He had been living in a carefully constructed fantasy, while she had been building an empire that would ensure her independence and security regardless of their relationship's outcome. The family court of Judge Margaret Harrison had seen countless divorce proceedings over her 23 years on the bench, but the case of Thornfield versus Thornfield was rapidly becoming one of the most extraordinary reversals in her extensive experience. The preliminary hearing had been scheduled as a routine asset division review, but the documentation Victoria Chambers continued presenting was transforming the proceeding into something approaching a financial crimes investigation. Judge Harrison studied the property deeds, business and corporation papers, and bank records spread across her desk with the careful attention of someone who understood that she was witnessing the complete unraveling of one party's fundamental assumptions about reality. Marcus Thornfield sat at the defendant's table looking physically ill, his expensive suit now rumpled and his face ashen with the shock of discovering his own financial irrelevance. Blake made a desperate final attempt to salvage his client's position by challenging the authenticity of Elena's documentation. He suggested that the sheer volume of assets and business interests Elena claimed to own was so far beyond what anyone had expected that the court should demand additional verification before accepting such extraordinary claims. Judge Harrison responded with the dry precision that had made her reputation as one of Manhattan's most respected family court jurists. Property deeds were matters of public record that could be instantly verified through official databases. Business and corporation documents were filed with state authorities and carried legal weight that could not be disputed through wishful thinking. Bank records from established financial institutions were among the most reliable forms of evidence that courts regularly evaluated. She had already taken the unusual step of having her clerk verify several of the key documents during the brief recess, and every piece of Elena's evidence had proven completely accurate and properly authenticated. Elena Marie Thornfield was indeed the sole owner of properties worth over $40 million, the controlling shareholder in businesses generating annual revenues exceeding $60 million, and the holder of investment accounts containing liquid assets that most people could not accumulate in several lifetimes. Marcus attempted to interrupt with claims that Elena had somehow hidden these assets during their marriage, but Judge Harrison silenced him with a look that had intimidated countless attorneys over the decades. Financial concealment required deliberate deception and active hiding of resources from one's spouse. Elena had done precisely the opposite by properly documenting every transaction, maintaining transparent records, and ensuring that Marcus had access to all relevant information throughout their marriage. The problem was not Elena's alleged deception, but Marcus's willful ignorance of financial matters that did not directly enhance his own ego. Judge Harrison had reviewed the evidence showing that Marcus had been informed about Elena's business activities repeatedly during their marriage, but had chosen to dismiss her explanations because they conflicted with his preferred narrative of masculine financial dominance. Elena's attorney presented additional evidence that Marcus had actually benefited enormously from Elena's discreet financial management. His consulting business had been able to take greater risks and pursue larger clients because Elena's independent wealth provided a financial safety net that protected their family from the uncertainties of entrepreneurial ventures. Judge Harrison noted that Elena's approach to their marital finances had been both legally proper and personally generous. She had allowed Marcus to receive public credit for achievements that were largely built on her financial foundation, had covered household expenses that exceeded his earning capacity, and had maintained the lifestyle that enabled Marcus to present himself as a successful businessman to his professional community. Blake made one final desperate argument that Elena's business success somehow created an obligation to share her wealth with Marcus based on their marital partnership. Judge Harrison's response was swift and definitive. Property ownership was determined by legal documentation, not by marital assumptions or emotional expectations. Elena owned her assets because she had purchased them with her own funds and had properly registered them in her name. The fact that Marcus had been living in Elena's properties and benefiting from Elena's income did not create retroactive ownership rights for him any more than a tenant could claim ownership of their landlord's building. Marriage created certain legal obligations and protections, but it did not automatically transfer property ownership from one spouse to another without explicit legal processes. Marcus began sobbing openly as Judge Harrison systematically destroyed every aspect of his legal position. He had no claim to the Manhattan penthouse where he had been living, no ownership stake in the consulting business that had built his professional reputation, and no legal access to the investment accounts that had funded their luxury lifestyle for over a decade. Judge Harrison then addressed the question of spousal support with the clinical precision that had characterized her entire review of the case. Marcus was requesting substantial alimony payments based on his claim that Elena should support him in the manner to which he had become accustomed during their marriage. However, the financial evidence showed that Marcus had never actually supported that lifestyle himself. Elena's income exceeded Marcus's by such enormous margins that any alimony calculation would essentially require Elena to continue subsidizing Marcus's living expenses exactly as she had been doing throughout their marriage. Judge Harrison found no legal justification for compelling a wealthy spouse to continue supporting a financially inferior partner who had contributed essentially nothing to the accumulation of marital assets. The consultation firm that Marcus had claimed as his primary achievement was legally owned by Elena, who had provided all startup capital and had maintained controlling interest throughout its operation. Marcus's role had been that of an employee rather than an owner, and his compensation had always been determined by Elena's business decisions rather than his independent success. Judge Harrison's ruling was comprehensive and devastating to Marcus's position. Elena would retain sole ownership of all properties currently registered in her name, which included every significant asset the couple had acquired during their marriage. The consulting business would continue operating under Elena's control, with Marcus having no ongoing role or ownership stake in the company he had believed was his own creation. Marcus would be permitted to remain in the Manhattan penthouse for 90 days to arrange alternative housing, after which Elena could exercise her full property rights, including the option to exclude him from her residence. He would receive no alimony payments, no division of Elena's investment portfolios, and no compensation for his alleged contributions to wealth that had been entirely generated by Elena's business activities. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrison delivered her final observations about the case. Marcus Thornfield had spent 15 years living as the dependent spouse of a remarkably successful businesswoman while maintaining elaborate delusions about his own financial importance. His assumptions about gender roles and economic dominance had blinded him to the reality of his situation so completely that he had entered divorce proceedings with no understanding of his actual legal position. Elena's behavior throughout their marriage had been exemplary from both legal and ethical perspectives. She had built substantial wealth through legitimate business activities, had shared the benefits of her success with her family, and had managed their household finances with remarkable competence and generosity. The fact that Marcus had chosen to ignore or dismiss Elena's explanations of her business activities did not create legal obligations for her to continue supporting his lifestyle or protecting his ego. Judge Harrison concluded by noting that the case would likely become a cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions based on outdated gender stereotypes rather than actual financial realities. Marcus had discovered that his wife's quiet competence masked extraordinary business acumen, and that his own contributions to their marital success had been far smaller than he had believed. As the court session concluded, Marcus remained seated in stunned silence while Elena gathered her belongings with the calm efficiency she had demonstrated throughout the proceedings. The man who had entered the courtroom expecting to divide Elena's imaginary dependence on him was leaving with nothing more than the clothes on his back and a 90-day deadline to find new housing he could actually afford. 3 months after Judge Harrison's ruling, Marcus Thornfield found himself standing in the cramped living room of a one-bedroom apartment in Queens, staring at the stack of moving boxes that contained everything he had been able to salvage from his former life. The 90-day grace period Elena had allowed him in the Manhattan penthouse had expired, and the reality of his new circumstances was as harsh as the fluorescent lighting in his budget housing complex. The consulting firm that had once carried his name now operated under new management, with Elena having installed a team of professional executives to run the company she had always owned. Marcus's former clients had been informed that he was no longer associated with Thornfield Strategic Solutions, and most had expressed no particular concern about the transition since they had primarily been working with Elena's handpicked staff members anyway. Marcus's attempts to start an independent consulting practice had failed spectacularly when potential clients learned about his divorce proceedings and the revelations about his actual role in his previous success. Word had spread quickly through Manhattan's tight-knit business community that Marcus Thornfield had been living off his wife's wealth while taking credit for her achievements. Professional reputation was everything in the consulting world, and Marcus's had been destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. Elena, meanwhile, had emerged from the divorce proceedings with her business empire not only intact, but actually strengthened. The publicity surrounding the case had brought attention to her remarkable success story, and several major financial publications had featured articles about her investment strategies and business acumen. She had been invited to speak at conferences about entrepreneurship and wealth building, finally receiving the public recognition that she had quietly earned over the previous 15 years. The children, now old enough to understand the financial realities of their parents' relationship, had chosen to remain primarily with Elena in the Manhattan penthouse. They had been shocked to learn about their mother's business success, but they were also old enough to remember the countless times Marcus had dismissed Elena's opinions and treated her contributions as unimportant. Their respect for their father had been permanently altered by the revelations about his actual role in their family's wealth. Blake had suffered professional embarrassment from his complete failure to research his client's actual financial position before filing divorce papers. His reputation for protecting wealthy men in divorce proceedings had been damaged by his spectacular miscalculation of the Thornfield case. He had been forced to refund Marcus's substantial legal fees and had lost several other high-profile clients who questioned his competence after such a public failure. Victoria Chambers had become something of a legend in family law circles for her methodical destruction of what had initially appeared to be a routine case favoring the husband. Her careful documentation and strategic presentation of evidence had created a template for other attorneys representing financially successful women whose contributions had been minimized or ignored by their spouses. Marcus's social circle had evaporated as quickly as his financial resources. The country club memberships, charity events, and business dinners that had defined his social life were no longer financially accessible, and his former friends had little interest in associating with someone whose success had been revealed as entirely illusory. The networking relationships he had cultivated over years of expensive social events had proven to be as shallow as his understanding of his own marriage. Elena had handled her victory with a grace that only emphasized the contrast between her character and Marcus's behavior throughout their relationship. She had not pursued vindictive legal actions beyond protecting her own interests, had not attempted to damage Marcus's reputation beyond the natural consequences of the truth being revealed, and had even provided him with references for potential employment opportunities despite his years of condescension and dismissal. The Manhattan penthouse had been completely redecorated to reflect Elena's personal taste rather than the masculine aesthetic Marcus had insisted upon during their marriage. The changes were subtle but significant, transforming the space from a showcase of corporate success into a warm family home that actually reflected the personality of its owner. Elena had finally created a living environment that honored her own achievements rather than maintaining the illusion of Marcus's importance. Marcus's new apartment in Queens was a daily reminder of how completely his life had changed. The commute to his part-time job at a small consulting firm required 2 subway transfers and took over an hour each way. His salary was less than Elena spent monthly on household expenses, and his work involved basic administrative tasks rather than the high-level strategic consulting he had once claimed to specialize in. The irony of his situation was not lost on the few people who still maintained contact with Marcus. He had spent 15 years criticizing Elena for her supposed dependence on his financial support, only to discover that he had been entirely dependent on her wealth and generosity throughout their marriage. The role reversal was so complete that it seemed almost deliberately orchestrated, though Elena had simply allowed Marcus to live in his preferred fantasy until divorce proceedings made the truth unavoidable. Elena's business success continued to grow as she finally received appropriate recognition for her investment acumen and entrepreneurial achievements. Several venture capital firms had approached her about partnership opportunities, and she was being courted by major corporations seeking her expertise in strategic planning and market analysis. The consulting skills that Marcus had believed were his own specialty turned out to be areas where Elena's knowledge far exceeded his understanding. As Marcus unpacked his belongings in Queens, he reflected on the countless warning signs he had ignored during their marriage. Elena's sophisticated understanding of financial markets, her mysterious phone calls with business partners, her detailed knowledge of real estate trends, her careful attention to legal documentation, all of it had been evidence of her true role as the family's financial architect. His arrogance and sexist assumptions had blinded him to reality so completely that he had entered divorce proceedings expecting to protect assets that had never belonged to him. The final cruel irony came when Marcus realized that Elena was now his landlord. The Queens apartment complex where he had found affordable housing was part of a real estate investment portfolio that Elena had been building for over a decade. She had unknowingly provided him with housing even after their divorce, though at market rates rather than the subsidized lifestyle he had enjoyed during their marriage. He was paying rent to the woman whose financial contributions he had spent 15 years dismissing as unimportant. What do you think about Elena's incredible strategic patience and Marcus's complete blindness to his own situation? Have you ever witnessed someone completely misunderstand their own circumstances like this? Let me know in the comments how you think you would have handled Elena's position, and whether you believe Marcus learned anything meaningful from this devastating revelation about who had really been in control all along.